Hi guys, this is Dr. John Bray Morris. You are watching the video series Shooting Up in the Dark, and today we are going to discuss the question, what is recovery? The question, what is recovery, or what is recovery from addiction, feels like a daunting concept to try and explain on a video, but for me, recovery means life. I know for sure that without recovery program, I would not be alive today, that my addiction would have caused me to relapse, taken over my life, and eventually just would have taken me down. So, recovery, first of all, is a miracle, a blessing, and I'm eternally grateful to have the opportunity to be in recovery. A lot of people in addiction, especially in drug addiction, don't survive, don't have the opportunity I've had. But in terms of what is recovery, I'll do a combination of sharing my experience and sharing, I guess, some clinical perspective on it. So, in the most basic sense, recovery from addiction is the phase in a person's life after they have made a decision to stop an addictive substance or behavior. And during this time, they remain committed to abstinence while focusing on the process of healing from the harms done in addiction and those in the past, and to understanding the reasons they became addicted, with a goal of personal growth and transcendence beyond addiction in any of its forms. Recovery looks different for each person, but essentially it is an ongoing change in life oriented towards finding fulfillment and wholeness, independence from any type of addiction. So it's finding a freedom, that's a good word, from compulsive and obsessive behavior or drug use. While recovery is a personal matter, according to the most well known and widely successful program, which is the 12-step model of recovery, working closely with and identifying with a group of persons also committed to this abstinence and change is key. And this is reflected in the phrasing of each step using the inclusive pronoun we, as in we admitted, we made a decision, we became entirely ready, etc. And indeed, for the newly clean addict, the prospect of never using again, of facing all of their demons and trying to right the wrongs they've done, feels completely overwhelming and impossible to do alone. So it is important that new members learn that they never have to be alone. They are encouraged to develop and maintain connections with others in recovery, to call for support without hesitation when facing a situation or feelings in which they might relapse. Recovery is about finding a new way to live and following the footsteps of others who have done it successfully. And there are millions of recovering addicts all over this world. And just to be clear, alcohol is a drug. So when I talk about substance addiction and recovery, I'm including alcohol. In my years dealing with addiction, on a personal level, as a physician with patients, and as a recovery community member, I've seen recovery successfully transform lives, even lives that seemed hopeless, no matter how near death or unreachable a person may have seemed, or how grotesque the details of their life in addiction, they can still recover. And addiction can happen to anyone. It happened to me. It occurs regardless of social, economic, religious status or background. And recovery communities are perhaps the most diverse group I've ever been a part of. But at the same time, each member knows the same devastation of addiction, and this unites us. Together, we seek to stay clean and recover. It can be hard to understand unless you're right in the middle of it, but the damage typically done to both the addict and his loved ones while in active addiction is extensive and severe. It's helpful to realize that addiction takes over every facet of a person under its control: their mind, personality, emotions, goals, motivations, all kinds of thoughts, including self-concept, identity, ability to love, beliefs, relationships, and even our spirits. eventually the addict becomes a shell of their former self, and it can seem like a walking dead. Seeing the extent and pervasiveness of the destruction of a person in addiction helps one also see what must be recovered. Most addicts are somewhat adept at hiding their addiction from people with whom they're not very close, until things become so severe that they stop even trying to hide it. In terms of different models of recovery, I have searched for what alternatives programs there are, and how they function and how effective they are in terms of keeping a person clean and sober, and continue to grow as an individual to their fullest potential. And there are some that I think work well for some people. But the model of recovery I chose to embrace to come to terms with my addiction in my life is the 12-step model. And I chose it because it's pervasive, structured. It's used in, I think, 191 countries. It's got a great track record of helping people get clean and stay clean. And I know personally dozens and dozens of people who have, through a 12-step recovery, been able to change their lives long term. So in describing my recovery, the best I can do is share my particular experience with the 12-step model and the suggestions that were made to me. As I see them, the steps collectively are a suggested path of healing and human growth, which any human being can follow, regardless of beliefs or circumstances or whether or not they have an identified addiction even. In fact, the 12-step model has been recognized as being a path to spiritual awakening or salvation, or whatever you want to call it, for anyone, not just people who are addicted. There is no religion or set of specific required beliefs associated with any 12-step program, nor is such required to be a member or to work with the steps. However, the 12 steps are definitely spiritual in nature, with a stated goal in the 12th step of, quote, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to others and practice these principles in all our affairs, unquote. My experience, though, is that there are many mini awakenings, and that how that happens, it's very open and broad. There are multiple manifestations or permutations of the recovering addict. So I've never felt forced to conform in any way. I don't believe that there is any arrival at a final destination through working the steps. Recovery is never accomplished or finished, but it's an ongoing process of learning human lessons and learning to transcend our wrongs, our limitations, and our suffering. The spiritual awakening, in my experience, is more like a series of multiple little small awakenings to the truth of who and what I am, that I'm here for a purpose, and how to allow a power greater than me, which is the divine, to manifest in my life. A common question is, what exactly is being recovered? What did I lose that I'm getting back in recovery? And just like with a lot of concepts, there are different layers or levels of meaning, like to what recovery is too: the everyday practical, the philosophical, the essential. And there are, in recovery, recovery occurs on different levels as well. It's true that although it's not guaranteed, we do recover a lot of stuff, sometimes. People tend to become more healthy and functional, so become more productive members of society than when they were using. So may recover jobs, possessions, relationships, status. I think you could say it's true that in recovery people regain their sanity, because addiction is definitely a mental disorder of obsession about thoughts and identity. So that's returned. And for me, I feel like, in essence, what I lost in addiction, and even before addiction, but certainly worse or exacerbated in addiction, was a knowing that I was okay, loved, and safe, that I was not alone, that I was not condemned, but rather connected to others, a part of bigger things, connected to God, to an eternal sense of reality, having a sense of belonging and oneness. For most of my life, I based my identity on other things, on external things. And that never works, and it actually creates a lot of pain. So I think I brought that to addiction, trying to kind of just treat that emotional and mental pain and that spiritual pain of feeling lost and feeling like I could never be enough and feeling caught up in the negativity of my failures and my self-condemnation, etc. I learned to base my sense of self and my identity and worthiness on external things, what other people thought of me, what I thought of myself, how, relationships, job, accomplishments, and my mind would just be continually perseverating and obsessing over all of this stuff, comparing myself to others, condemning myself, having a lot of self-hatred is the bottom line, and lack of self-acceptance. And that's a lot of what the disease of addiction is in terms of its mental aspect. Just that tendency to obsess, be completely self-centered and egotistical at the same time, unaccepting of myself, unable to forgive or love myself. So in recovery, I have been able to learn to love and forgive myself, give myself grace, treat myself kindly, and it's a work in progress, but I believe the human mind all of our minds is in a process of evolution, but we're largely stuck in thinking about ourselves, the ego, and the millions of ways in which life is problematic, we're unique, repeating endless versions of the same stories, striving for more, for something that we're never finding, never being complete. So, and I think that's a spiritual quest which can be brought out in addiction. And it's part of why I use drugs. And for a time I thought the drugs were a solution because they enabled me to have more control over how I felt and how I thought, and not just be carried away by my mind and emotions. But ultimately, that never works. I mean, early in addiction, the effect of the drug can, I guess, help in a sense to make one create one's own reality. It seems to give freedom from the insanity of constant thinking and to neutralize negative emotions. And it works in a sense, but just temporarily, because while it's quote unquote working, the addict will, and I did, form a bond of emotional dependence on the drug, and even to the point of worship. And slowly but surely, all other aspects of life became erased. And before I knew it, any benefit the drug may have had on terms of what it gave me was outweighed by what it sucked out of my life. And this will continue as a cycle until the point of death, if not interrupted. But through all of this, recovery is always possible. On a practical level, addiction took away my ability to make choices, its action on the neural circuitry in the brain of reward and survival, eventually convincing me that only continued use of the drug mattered, nothing else mattered. It reduced my full, rich life to nothing more than daily existence and fear, aloneness, and increasing desperation. And convinced I would die without my drug, even when there were no benefits or relief, I continued to pursue it to the exclusion of all else, disconnecting from everything: self, intimate relationships, spirituality, nature, hobbies, friends, God. So it's sad. Addiction really imprisoned me. And so recovery is about freedom, learning how to live without drugs and learning how much more there is to life than I ever knew possible. And recovery for me has been a pathway to finding authentic meaning, connection, and serenity. In terms of the actual work of recovery, I was advised, no matter how I felt about it, to consistently do these 5 things: attend meetings, do service work, don't use no matter what, get a sponsor, and work the steps. My experience with each step was that I would take the time, many hours in total, reflecting and writing, processing, based on direction from a recovery guidebook and questions from my sponsor relevant to that step. And I would then meet with my sponsor and discuss my discoveries and my answers, often being redirected to be more honest or more vulnerable, or to understand things that I wasn't understanding. And then after completing all the questions for a step, we would discuss what it would mean to walk the talk or walk the step, live or demonstrate the step in daily life, and practice doing that for a while and watch myself change. It took about 18 months of regular dedicated work to go through all 12 steps my first time. But by the time it was ending, I had so much new information, so much more had been revealed, that it was obvious that repeating the steps was going to be a completely different experience. And so it's never over. There's no graduation. The process of working steps continues to go on today in my life. Depending on the listener's interest, I would like to produce future segments which provide an overview of each step in a bit more detail. So obviously, recovery is a lifelong process. To me, it's the hidden gift of addiction. Addiction itself is nothing but pain and loss. But if it brings one to recovery like it did me, and someone can benefit the way from recovery that I have and so many millions have, then I have to be grateful for that kind of change, even grateful for the entire experience. So thank you. Please feel free to send comments and questions. My intention is to produce additional segments on recovery and steps. That partly depends on what I hear back from you guys. So take care and see you again soon.